Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammam sangham namasami. For those of you who aren't familiar with our tradition, the little chant that Ravi did just before, just right now, was requesting in Pali a brief recollection that was requesting a talk on Dhamma. And it's part of the tradition that, at least here in the monastic community, that we have to receive a request to teach. We don't just go out and start preaching to everybody, whether they want it or not. So we have this tradition of having this formal request, and it just kind of caused me, for some reason this time, flashing back to the first time I heard that before I was a monk, a layman, sitting at a retreat that Ajahn Sumedho or Ajahn Amaro, or both of them, were leading in Santa Rosa probably 30 years ago. And I was all new to everything. And the first night, one of the lay attendants that had traveled with them did that same request. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is somebody who's losing their mind. They're starting to chant this thing out and the monastics are just politely listening to him, and are they going to do anything or going to say anything? And then it dawned on me, oh no, this was actually a legitimate request, but it was just kind of amusing to watch my mind thinking, no, somebody's really losing control here. And kind of plays a little bit into theme I was thinking about maybe talking around this evening. The sense of control that we experience or that we seek so much in our lives as a way of finding a sense of stability and a sense of refuge, a point of reference, if you will, to the world around us, the confusing world around us, and the fact that there's all the ups and downs that we experience as human beings, the pains and the pleasures, and our kind of relentless pursuit of trying to control our experience, control the world around us, and how that leads us into suffering. And very strongly related to the sense of self, that a perception that we all live with and buy into and operate under, really, for the most part, throughout our conscious experience. And how the teachings tell us that of the many aspects of this sense of self, that this aspect of control is strongly related to how strong we experience that perception of self. In one of actually it was the second discourse that the Buddha taught just a few months after his enlightenment. The theme was around this subject, the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the discourse on not self, and has become one of the primary teachings that the Buddha has offered as a way towards pointing us towards liberation from suffering. If we can understand this aspect of this perception that we live under most of the time, this sense of self and this wish to control our environment, to always maximize pleasure and minimize pain, then we'll see clearly, if we understand this and see this deeply and practice with this perception, then if we gain insight into it, then the freedom that results from letting go of that perception and reconstructing how we view experience in the world and our relation to it, this can lead to an extraordinary sense of relief and freedom. So there's a lot of different ways that we kind of weave this perception of self into our experience. It's kind of one of the overriding themes through everything that we tend to view as part of who we are, or the combination of all of these parts. In the Buddha's teachings, the Five Khandas, the Five Aggregates, those aggregates of form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, that when we experience them and view them with clinging and attachment, that forms the basis for suffering and is wrapped up with this identification, is what we would call personality view, or Sakkaya Ditthi, this view that any one or all of these five aggregates of experience, the body, feelings, perceptions, various mental formations, and consciousness, that either in part or in aggregate, if we view them with clinging and attachment, that's who we think we are in one form or another. And a lot of the insight practice, the reflective practices, is oriented towards deconstructing that assumption. Not trying to posit a certain reality of there is no self, because that's taking yet another stance, adopting another view that we can identify with, but just looking at what it is that we normally assume to be ourselves, and contemplating, asking ourselves, is that really the case? If we talk about a self as, or an aspect of self-view as some unchanging aspect of our experience, something solid that we can say is everlasting, that stands up to all the winds of change in the world and in our experience, in our bodies and minds, something that surpasses that, something that lives beyond that, something that's unchanging. This is tied up. This is what we often call, or I assume to be, this self. So we start to look at all the possible aspects of experience that we can possibly consider of who we think we might be, and a little bit, piece by piece, part by part, we look at that and ask ourselves very clearly: is this who I really am? Is there something that's unchanging that I have control over, that is part of this experience? And we methodically do that. And the more clear our mind is through the settling practices of meditation and the development of clarity of mind for clear seeing, the more we are able to see these contemplations in a deep way. And so we start with the body, which is often a primary focus of the sense of self. And the Buddha, in this second discourse that he gave, goes through each of these five aggregates and asks the monks to consider the fact, he kind of states it right up front, out in the open. Form, the body is not self. If the body were self, form were self, then form would not lead to affliction, and we would be able to say to it, let it be like this, or let it not be like this. We would have that control if there were actually a self in the body, or a body in the self, or in relation to self, or something that we could call, related to this body, called me or mine. But since this body, he continues on, but since this body is not self, it therefore leads to affliction, because one is not able to say in regards to it, this is myself, this is who I am. I am control. There is control over it. We have a modicum of control. We can feed it, we can nourish it, we can give it certain treatments, take care of it the best way we can, clean it up and make it presentable, and use it to get us through our daily routines. But there's a lot about the body that we don't really have control over. The body has a certain trajectory of if it lives its full lifespan of natural lifespan that we might consider, say, around 90 or 100 years if we're lucky, then it has a certain general progression of after birth. It goes through its developmental phases. We don't have usually much conscious control over that. It matures, it gets into its peak years of energy and performance and mental activity in its 20s and in its 30s, and on, sometimes beyond that. But then after a certain period of time, it starts to deteriorate into old age and eventually death. And none of this is really something that, if we had any choice of, there's nothing in that that we can ultimately control. And even when we're young, much less when we're, much more when we're old, but the sickness that can come, we don't invite that in. We don't wish that to happen to us. But this body is an organic, biological piece of equipment that is affected by various and sundry ailments and illnesses, sometimes temporary, sometimes chronic. And in the end, we all share the very common experience of death, of having to let go of this body. So in that sense, there is really no ultimate control. A bit we can do to influence it through wise attention and care, but ultimately it is this heap of elements, this collection of tissues, of bones, of muscles, of internal organs, skin, various sense organs, eyes and ears, and all of these components of the body are just organic elements that have a certain genetics and biology that have their own certain laws. And the body essentially follows those laws of nature. So because of that transitoriness, how can we say this is who I am? The Buddha encourages us to really actively and repeatedly consider this, bring this to our attention. And even as a long-time Buddhist practitioner who has been considering these things, bringing them to contemplation, one can see how the attachment is very, very strong. The illusion of this being maybe not who I am, but at least something that is mine to control, that there is some aspect of ownership or possession that one can have. And in good times, sometimes one doesn't experience that so intensely, but all it takes sometimes is a threat to the body, or even a minor problem, a minor illness or a minor condition that, while unpleasant, is certainly survivable. But watching when that happens, how the mind contracts so quickly around that particular aspect of the body that's not functioning the way we want it to, and the sudden gathering of that sense of needing to do something, needing to control, needing to get rid of that which shouldn't be there, or making better that which is wrong, or not in compliance with what we view as healthy or to be expected. And how quickly the relative ease with which we think we hold the body can drop away when there's a threat. So it just shows the powerful nature of the conditioning to identify with this body. So it's always useful to just repetitively try and re-perceive our control, and to continuously ask ourselves, do I really have ultimate control? There's lots of contemplative exercises that are very useful for this one, going through and looking at all of the various automatic functions of the body, the breathing, the heartbeat. In moments of quiet contemplation, you can really feel some of the internal movements of bodily fluids and bodily parts that really we don't pay much attention to. But keeping those in mind with the idea of seeing and asking yourselves, how much control is there really here in this breathing? I can try and stop it, but does it really stop for very long? Even if I try very hard to make it stop, it takes over, the body takes over and keeps on breathing. Same with the heartbeat. You might be able to make it go a little faster, a little bit slower in some ways through activities or mental determination. But essentially the heart keeps beating at 60 to 100 times a minute, every minute that you're alive, which is incredible. It has its own life. Heart and lungs just keep going on, all the metabolic processes. You don't pay any attention to them, yet they keep going. This body just keeps on going in its own way. So to bring that as an act of contemplation, act of reflection, is there control, ultimate control over this body? And at first glance, people who haven't really done much of that practice, it can seem a bit disorienting and confusing and maybe a bit unsettling. But as time goes on, one starts to actually relish those moments when one truly gets a sense or an insight into the lack of control, because it takes it takes a big burden off of our expectations and of our compulsive needs to always have it be the way we want it to be. We can accept the fact that it is essentially not under our control. And as scary as that might seem at first glance, it's actually quite freeing in that we can still be aware of needing to take care of it and use it for good purpose, but we don't have this sense of fear or anxiety in relation to into it when things start to go wrong. And the older you get, the more you start to realize the potential for all the things that can go wrong, and that sense of growing acceptance of the uncontrollability is a real refuge, and in fact it is a very enjoyable experience to just let go of trying to make the body the way it isn't. So the concern to prop it up and make it attractive, to make it function in exactly the way we want it to, the expectation that it be anything other than how it is at this moment, all of that starts to die away, and there's a tremendous sense of freedom and relief. It's giving this body a break. We don't have to be in charge. And that way the body actually relaxes too. And there's a sense of naturalness that comes with our relationship to this body. Then the Buddha encourages us to continue on through these other aggregates of experience, getting more into what we would call the mind itself, the aggregates related to mind, the different feelings that we have, the feeling tone that accompanies all of our experience, the feeling tone of pleasant experience, unpleasant experience, and neutral, that which doesn't pull us strongly in one or another direction. And with that same contemplation, how much control do we have over these feelings of pleasantness and unpleasantness? In any moment of experience, physical or mental, there's a certain quality of pleasantness or unpleasantness that accompanies most everything, even if it's subtle. And some that are so subtle that they move towards what we would call neutral, things that we don't really notice that much. But to realize that we try and spend so much of our time trying to control those feelings. Again, this sense of I should have some control and will always move towards trying to maximize pleasure and minimize painful experience, no matter how pleasant or no matter how difficult it might be. The sense that we should be able to control those experiences. And we can see what that does to the mind. It keeps us just constantly on the move, ever seeking pleasant experience, and getting wrapped up in the agitation and the unsettledness, the anxiety even of pursuit of pleasure through the senses, or pursuit of pleasure through mental experiences, the intellect itself as well. And how we spend an equal amount of time in fear or resistance of unpleasant experience. The moment something unpleasant starts to come into our lives, watching the resistance to that, the wanting to get away from, not experience things that are unpleasant, all the way from very, very unpleasant experiences of body and mind to minor ones. And we just get habitually caught in that seeking out what we want to experience and trying to get rid of what we don't want to. And the agitation that creates in the heart. So if we start to see the world of experience as kind of 50-50, 50% pleasant, 50% unpleasant, as it is in this human realm for the most part, and again, there's a modicum of control, but it's pretty temporary. As soon as we pursue and attain some sort of pleasant experience, it rapidly changes. And when it changes, it becomes a painful experience. Just the loss itself of a pleasant experience is painful. The ending of a painful experience is pleasant. And we just keep ourselves bouncing back and forth between pleasant and unpleasant, and the mental reactions to those experiences. And it's a habitual pattern. It's programmed very deeply. But if we can start to see and accept again that same lack of control that we can experience with the body, that fundamental uncontrollability, that things are running according to certain laws of nature, even in the mind, then we learn to observe them, see their causes and conditions, see them as they arise, as they change, and abide in more equanimity, so that we're not moved to habitually react to get what we want, to get away from what we don't want. And with that equanimity, that sense of ease of mind that comes with accepting the way things are, there is peace. That lack of agitation. Our perceptions, the ways we perceive the world, the mental categories and definitions and ways that we identify objects and relate to them, how we perceive our internal world, how we perceive other people. Those are also another aggregate of our mental experience that we try and exert control over. We want our perceptions or our memories to conform to what pleases us. We want people to be the way in which we experience the most pleasure. We want to have perceptions of others in accord with what brings us a sense of ease. We want people to like us. We want there always to be people who are praising us and see us in good light. We get upset when other people see us in different ways and don't see us the way we want them to see us. We get quite stuck in patterns of how we relate to the world, and we very much see the world see and experience the world through habitual patterns. We essentially program ourselves to perceive the world in many different ways that we think will bring us some sort of sense of control. In fact, the whole perceptual process is a way of organizing information, organizing sensory experience to make some sense out of it. If it was just this random collection of sights and sounds and images and colors and various sensations that we didn't organize into understandable units, then life would just be a chaotic experience of different sensory stimulations. But we have this process of perception that categorizes in groups and identifies into objects and ideas. And when those things seem to be out of our control, when they're not to our liking, then we suffer. So again, we have to see that there's a relative uncontrollability sometimes in how we perceive the world, how we organize the world, and it goes according to its own nature, its own laws, and the fact that other people have different perceptions and perceive things differently than we do. And when we come to accept that the world around us isn't necessarily stable in that way, and that perceptions change, and they have their own laws, these kind of mental activities, mental patterns have their own laws as well, then we come to see them just as they are, which are temporary constructs, temporary ways of viewing our experience, and that they change. On all the mental formations, the various thoughts of the intellect, the moods that we experience, this aspect of mental activity is constantly changing. We take a lot of refuge in our intellect. How many times do you hear of people saying, well, I don't really, I can accept the fact that the body gets old or that the body's going to die, but I I don't want to lose my mental faculties. That would be the worst possible thing. I can accept the fact that, I might get some sort of disease or physical ailment or physical limitation, but as long as I can keep my mind, as long as I can think clearly and operate the mind, the intellect, then I'll be okay. But if that deteriorates, I don't want to have to experience that. That's the worst possible thing that could happen. But yet, do we really have control over that either? Myself and Ajahn Pasano, Debbie and Josh went to visit an old friend of ours a few days ago, a woman that has been a supporter of our monastery and has given us a tremendous amount of help over the years through her professional services, volunteering. And as she's been getting older, signs of mental deterioration started happening over the past several years. Probably some sort of Alzheimer's-related disease, dementia of some sort. And her mental faculties starting to deteriorate, particularly around judgment, making clear and appropriate decisions, and certain personality aspects are becoming more exaggerated. Bits and pieces of memory starting to go. That's a new development since we had seen her last, and certain people that she was quite close to that we had in common as friends, she doesn't remember now when we were referring to them. And it's both sad and sobering, and a wake-up call that this is something that happens to us, particularly now that we've found ways to extend the life of the body, the internal organs. We've been pretty successful with certain medical treatments, ways of keeping the heart going, keeping the internal organs all functioning to keep this body alive for longer periods of time. But yet we haven't made a huge amount of progress in preventing some of these kind of neurological mental brain deteriorations that lead to this incapacity of intellectual functioning, this deterioration. So the body's living longer and providing the opportunity for these kinds of more chronic cognitive impairments to arise and manifest. And there's a real sense of identification with that aspect of our experience that we hold as who we are. And if that's starting to be challenged, then there's this great sense of loss of identity and control. But we can also reflect on that, perhaps someday we will be in that same situation. We may not be able to think as clearly as we used to. I even start to experience some of that now myself, not hopefully in terms of an actual disease, but just the natural loss of clarity and acuity of the thinking process. You can just sort of see in little bits and pieces how the cognitive process, the reasoning, or the different kinds of ways that we try and evaluate the world around us and think about concepts and construct ideas, learn new things, particularly new learning. These are starting to get a little more fuzzy around the edges. And I find it very helpful to reflect of, okay, well, this is part of what it is to age, and if I live really long, who knows, I may experience some of that, or all of that, complete deterioration of intellectual functioning. So if I take refuge in that as who I am, I'm going to suffer, but if I accept the fact that this is something that can happen as a part of nature, then hopefully I'll be able to kind of maybe sit back from a little bit more from a distance and watch the show, and maybe accept it with a bit of humor and humility. Consciousness itself, this basic fragmented awareness that we have that manifests through the different sense objects, visual consciousness, darting to hearing consciousness, darting to consciousness of the body's sensations, all the aspects of the five physical senses, and the consciousness, the awareness of the intellectual properties as well, this basic movement of attention throughout all of these sense bases that weaves together this sense of a personal experience. We weave together these fragments of sights and sounds and tastes and tactile sensations and smells and thoughts and ideas. Our consciousness moves rapidly from one to another and creates this woven sense of identity. It's kind of the seamstress, if you will, that sews it all together to make it look like one big fabric of experience that one can identify with. And that as the various sense organs change and morph over time, do we really have a sense of control over this unity of experience through this rapid movement of consciousness? That even that changes over time too. So the Buddha is really encouraging us to use these aspects of what we call our self, the self-view that comes with holding on to any of these aspects of body or mind as who we are, of holding on to them, trying to use them and maximize the experience, maximize the pleasurable experience, minimize the painful experience, and exercise control over this whole unit. The Buddha says that if we can learn to let go of that sense of ownership, that sense of ultimate control, then there's an experience of freedom that goes beyond these five aggregates. That the mind, the heart that experiences these, that is aware of these five aggregates and how we get fooled by them into thinking that that's who we are, that there is a fundamental quality of awareness and of knowing these processes that can be freed from the craving, the clinging, the attachment that accompanies these experiences of body and mind. And that as that craving, that clinging to these five aggregates starts to weaken, we naturally will experience a greater sense of freedom from the suffering that comes from trying to control all of these experiences. We learn to just be with the flow of bodily experience, the flow of mental experience, the flow of all of these sensations and feelings and ideas, and not try to gain some sort of sense of self, ultimate control over them. And as we see them in their true nature, as they arise and pass away in our own experience, there's a sense of lightness and freedom from the bondage of trying to be a certain way and to experience only certain kinds of experience. And we can accept the flow, the natural flow of our bodies and of our minds and of the experience around us in a way that is very easeful and peaceful and sublime. that process becomes more refined over time, we start to be able, the teachings tell us that the ultimate end point of that process of letting go is one of complete freedom, where the mind, the heart, is not bound by its eons of conditioning, the impulses, the conditioning that causes us to repetitively move into confusion, into delusion, and the forces of craving and clinging will start to abate, and then those are the forces that propel us into repetitive suffering lifetime after lifetime. And that process of letting go of craving for pleasant and unpleasant experience, avoiding unpleasant, always craving for annihilation of unpleasant experience, and for this process of just being, this process of becoming, that propels us from one birth to another birth, whether it's a birth within this very lifetime or a birth into another lifetime, and the unlimited possibilities of continued rebirth. Then the mind doesn't incline in that direction. The mind lets go of that need to identify with experience in the conditioned realm. So the ultimate place that this can take us is to a true sense of freedom from suffering, of a true freedom of the heart that is not dependent on any condition whatsoever. And this is the gateway to what the Buddha calls the ultimate freedom, the freedom of the deathless, the freedom of the cooling of all craving, the cooling of all clinging, of all becoming, the ending of the cycles of birth and death. But before we get to that point, we can see the benefits little by little of bringing this contemplation, just the ease of mind that comes when we're able to let go of trying to be absolutely in control of our bodies and of our minds, and the sense of relief that comes from being able to just be with things as they are. So, a few reflections for this Saturday night, and please take with whatever is useful and set aside that which is not.
Sadhu